Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly podcast in which we talk about anything about the Beatles, their past, the present, whatever we feel like in the moment. And I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the co-hosts of this show, and many of you know me from my other weekly Beatles program, a syndicated show on the Beatles called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by some of my regular co-hosts on the show at this time out. First of all, the man who writes for Beatles Examiner, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And also one of the writers for Beatle Fan, who's been with them since the very beginning of the magazine, that being Al Sussman. Hello, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
Ken, let me say one quick thing. I know this will be on way after the fact, but I just want to say Happy John Meets Paul Day, guys.
Woo!
Woo!
Okay.
Okay. There we go.
And in advance, happy 75th birthday to Ringo. Of course, by the time you folks hear this, it'll be after the fact, but he will be 75 years old.
That's right.
Yeah. I will be celebrating tomorrow.
That's right.
It's all Ringo Day.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sorry to say that one of our regulars, our resident musicologist, Alan Cozen, unfortunately, he has some health issues to attend to, and he's not able to make our show this time out, so we all wish him well, and we hope he'll be with us on our next show. And we have a special guest with us on the phone. His name is Andrew Grant Jackson. He is the author of a book that came out earlier this year. It's called 1965, The Most Revolutionary Year in Music. And ironically, it's funny that we have Andrew on because Al has been posting since January 1st this year on Facebook a video of a song that the way he explains it, is one of the reasons why 1965 was the greatest year in music. So obviously, Al and Andrew, you are of like minds. And so I'm wondering if, before we talk to Andrew, Al, did you have any idea that Andrew's book was coming out? And
Actually, I do, because Andrew and I talked at the LA Fest for Beatles fans last October, and he mentioned that he had a new book coming out about 1965, which immediately, got the attention of my antenna, because for decades, as Ken well knows, I've been saying that 1965 is the single greatest year in the history of rock and roll. And on New Year's Day, kind of just sort of very organically, I said, you know what? We're now into the 50th anniversary year. Maybe it's time that I put my 2 cents where my mouth is and actually begin showing why 1965 is the greatest year in the history of rock and roll. So beginning in chronological order, not in any kind of rating, but strictly in chronological order, beginning with Reparata and the Delrons, Whenever a Teenager Cries. I began posting each day a YouTube clip of a song that I consider to be one of the 365 reasons why 1965 is the single greatest year in the history of rock and roll.
Okay, so why don't I start by asking the two of you the very basic question of why you feel that way. And I must admit, look, I love the 60s. I love every part of the 60s. I love the pre-Beatles era, too. And, for so many reasons, I could probably mention 1964 or 1967 or any year there and give you a reason why I feel that year was so tremendous. So what is it about that particular year for both of you that stands out why you feel the way you do that it was the greatest year in pop music? We'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, I'm a huge fan of every year in the 60s too, 66, 67, but 68. But I think all those years, they're kind of building on the innovations that really kicked into gear in 65. So I wouldn't personally say I think it's personally what's the best to somebody, but I I was just making the case that this was the most revolutionary year because new forms of like lyrics for rock and roll and sounds and genres all really started exploding in that year.
Mm-hmm.
That later years they built on this, like psychedelia, Sergeant Pepper. You can trace a lot of the things from there, from sitar to orchestration and everything, back to the all the groundbreaking things the Beatles and Beach Boys started doing in '65.
Okay. And Al, how about you?
Sort of launching off what Andrew was just saying. In 1965, you have the British invasion at really the first wave of the British invasion at its height. Andrew, I believe there was a week in June or July when I believe there were eight. I think you would pointed out there were 8 songs by
May
British
8th.
acts.
I'm looking at my little timeline at the beginning of the book. My little cheat sheet here is May 8th.
Yes.
Eight British invasion singles, and one of them was Australian. I think the only American one was, what was it, Count Me In? Ironically titled.
Gary Lewis and the Playboys.
Gary Lewis and the Playboys, right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you have the British invasion at really high tide, at least in the first wave. Then you have really in effect, the invention of folk rock in the spring with the release of the Byrds' cover of Mr. Tambourine Man and then their first album, plus Dylan's move to electric sound. Then you've also got this whole new wave of bands that were created or whose sound developed in the wake of the Beatles. As I said, this whole new generation of bands that had formed or who had formulated their sound in the wake of the initial success in America of the Beatles and the other British bands. You have the McCoys, you have the Sir Douglas Quintet, a group that even though they were from Texas, kind of fashioned themselves as an English type band, as did the Beau Brummels, who were a group from San Francisco. So you have that. You have the beginning of the golden era of as we called it back then, soul music, with Motown beginning really its real in the midst of its golden era. You have the first real stirrings at Stax, plus so many other artists, Wilson Pickett, James Brown, Fontella Bass, albeit a one-hit wonder, but still a classic record in Rescue Me. So things like that. And you also have classic records from the Beach Boys that were setting the stage for the great musical leaps that Brian Wilson would be making in 1966 and 67. So you have all of that, plus a lot more that I'm not even really thinking of. It seemed like every week there would be some great new record that you'd be hearing on one of the top 40 radio stations of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the big things too that you could throw in there would be James Brown inventing funk. With Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, that became like the groundwork for hip hop and all that later to come.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment? The 1965 actually was kind of an American explosion, and part of the reason may have been something I found in reading today, that American authorities drastically cut the number of work permits given to UK groups, which gave people like the Beau Brummels and Gary Lewis and the Playboys and a lot of others, a little more room to come out there and to get popular, which is really interesting that the authorities had done that. I get you could kind of speculate the reason for that, but whether they were trying to keep the British groups down, or whether they were trying to make way for the American groups or whatever. But that was that I don't recall ever hearing that before. Did either of you guys ever hear that one before?
Well, conversely, I think Andrew may have touched on that in the book, because conversely, that ruling greatly retarded the Kinks' ability to gain much of a foothold in this country, right, Andrew?
Yeah, there was they had all these run-ins when their summer tour, like I think he was a representative from the musicians union, started needling Ray Davies, I guess, about his wife. Off the top of my head, I can't remember if she was Lithuanian, but like of Eastern European. And he started saying that she a communist, and so Ray shoved him or something, and that got them banned. That plus, they were dancing. A couple of the Kinks were dancing cheek to cheek on like Hullabaloo TV show, which freaked out people because they had long hair, and they put on a little extra fayness sometimes, So
wow,
there was he also, they with customs, they had a little bit of run-ins, like, are you a boy or a girl? And he goes something like, oh yeah, and that's my sister. They were just really smart asses to everybody, and it kind of got him in some hot water. John Gacy, the serial killer, had him over for drinks too. He was like the local committee. I forget, it was like the like not the VA, but some sort of local, what do you call those? Like just a community group, and he brought the group over to have drinks, but they got a little creeped out by him. That serial killer who make the paintings of the clowns. John Wayne Gacy, and so they left, and they found out later that serial killer had him over to their house for after show entertainment.
Wow.
I just wanted to say, first of all, for all of our listeners, we will be talking about the Beatles pretty soon in this conversation. Just in case anybody's wondering, because this is a Beatles show. But I just want to touch upon a couple of things. First of all, something Andrew said in the very beginning. There is a distinction that you can make between what you think is the best year and also what's the most revolutionary. They may not go hand in hand. It all depends upon your musical taste. And I wanted to ask all of you something, and I'll ask Steve this first, but because a lot of attention's given right now to 1965 being the groundbreaking year that it was, is it more important, does something like that have more of an impact on us because it was the first time it was groundbreaking? Because you could certainly say, and I can relate this easily to the Beatles, Rubber Soul was probably the first time there was a huge leap creatively in the songwriting on Beatles albums. And there was always a gradual progression going from Please Please Me through Help. But once you got to Rubber Soul, there was that big jump right there. But then you had the biggest climb ever, to me anyway, when they went into Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. So you can compare the initial groundbreaking to what might be considered the strongest as far as groundbreaking and innovation. Does it matter to you which has the biggest impact, the first time, or whether or not they perfected things and finessed things and even brought it to higher levels later on?
I think back then it was the initial impact that hit everybody the hardest. I mean, going back to '64, it was the emergence of the Beatles that made the biggest splash, not only with the fans, but with the media. All the stuff that came after was kind of added, of course, to the to their aura, and added to their to their how great they were. But the first time really was what got everybody. And 65 had so many groundbreaking things. I was just watching the other night on DirecTV. For those of you that have DirecTV, there's an on-demand with Brian Wilson, and just listening to his band. And I had just seen the Beach Boys, about a week before that. But listening to his band do all those old songs with Al Jardine, who's playing with him, it's just astonishing. I mean, it's just really, because there's so many things he did that year, and I'm just using Brian Wilson as an example. I mean, there were so many other things going on, in 65. But 65 kind of added to everything. I mean, it was like, yeah, we had 64, but then you had 65, boom, 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 and it was just one surprise after another. But again, I think the initial impact in 64, was probably the biggest, but I think more now we look at the impact later on, but I think back then, it was really the first time. The full impact of what was going on really wasn't that. We didn't really look at it. Back then we were just too busy listening to the music and enjoying the transistor radios, and listening to people like Cousin Brucey and Murray the K and everybody else. So, Al, you feel that way?
Absolutely. In retrospect, we can tell that, for instance, you just mentioned Brian Wilson, that the side 2 of the Beach Boys Today and side 2 of Summer Days and Summer Nights kind of set the stage for Pet Sounds. Dylan's Going Electric and the release of the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man LP set the stage for the Lovin' Spoonful and the Mamas and Papas and all of the folk rock acts that would emerge, many of them during 1966. Things like that. The frankly, side 2 of Help, of the British Help album, set the stage for the musical advances that the Beatles would take on Rubber Soul. So there was a lot of development, you could say, of different aspects of the music that would really burst forth in 66 and 67. But I always say that you could put in terms of the quality of the music, you could put a postage stamp over 64, 65, 66, maybe even 67, because they're that close. I just have a personal preference for 1965.
No, but getting back to my original question, do you think that because of that groundbreaking year of 65, and hey, let's face it, 64 was groundbreaking too. How do you even differentiate between 64 and 65 when you have the British invasion happening in 64? You were just talking about Motown in 65. Mm-hmm. Motown was huge in 64. It was the big year of the Supremes, most of all, outside of the Beatles.
Could I say one? I think the thing that you can really differentiate, the one thing is the lyrics in rock, which actually this month is the month that folk rock really exploded in a sense, because you had Satisfaction, which had anti-advertising lyrics, inspired by Dylan, top of the charts all month. Mr. Tambourine Man still hovering in the top 5, and then suddenly you had Eve of Destruction leaked like around July 20th. Help comes out July 19th, which was very introspective. Dylan, Like a Rolling Stone, comes out the 20th. Lovin' Spoonful comes out that same day. Do You Believe in Magic? Newport, July 25th. I think the lyrics is the one thing that in rock and roll, I mean, the people that Dylan had been doing great lyrics, but all acoustic in his folk little area, in 64. So 65 seemed like, especially with like Eve of Destruction, #1, the first time Al, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the first time in the pop charts that kind of top, I guess Blowing in the Wind was a top hit too, but was that different? Like the lyrics being at the top of the teenage pop charts, the folk rock kind of lyrics?
I don't think it was the first. I'm not. I'm just working from memory, but I don't think it was the first time. But you know what? I have a book in my lap that will probably tell me the answer. So give me a few minutes, and I will look and see.
Right. I don't think "Blowing in the Wind" got to #1. It was a top 5, but I don't think it got to #1. But I think Eve of Destruction was the first record of that type of what they called protest music that actually did reach #1 on the national pop charts.
Maybe, because when I was writing the book, it's hard to say '64, what was really different. So I was just wondering, maybe the lyrics was the most different thing in '65, as opposed to, because musically maybe there wasn't, there's a lot of overlap with '64. But you guys would know better than me, though, for sure.
Now you have to. One thing you have to remember. We should add that Andrew, and this is one of the amazing things about his book. Andrew is not one of us dinosaurs. Andrew drew his inspiration. Andrew drew his inspiration for the book because of his father's enthusiasm for 1965 and the music of '65. And he did an amazing amount of research. I know how tough that is, having done, my own book. But he really kind of gets, quote unquote, the feel of 1965. But I think, for those of us who actually did go through the year, we couldn't really sense in real time the how much of an advance there was. But it's like, as I said, it seemed as if every day there was some new great record. For instance, I have in my hand the biggest top 40 radio station in New York, in the country by 1965, by the middle of '65, was WABC in New York. This was their top 10 for this very week, 50 years ago. At number 10 is "I'm a Happy Man" by the Jive Five, actually a kind of a doo-wop group from the late 50s and early 60s with kind of an updated sound for that time. Number 9 is "What's New Pussycat?" Burt Bacharach and Hal David's song, the title song from the movie, by Tom Jones, who, even though he's considered a pop artist, was at that point considered to be part of the British invasion. Number 8 is "For Your Love" by the Yardbirds, which was their breakthrough hit, written by Graham Gouldman. If this was the record that caused Eric Clapton to leave the Yardbirds and to be replaced by Jeff Beck. And the Yardbirds are, obviously have been a favorite of serious rock fans all along. Number 7 is "Wooly Bully" by Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, a great example of Tex-Mex music, a little bit of a novelty, but still great dance record. Number 6 was "Yes, I'm Ready" by Barbara Mason. One-hit wonder, but a great R&B ballad. 5 is "Caramia" by Jay and the Americans. With the lead singer of Jay and the Americans was Jay Black, who has an operatic voice. And go to YouTube and look up the performance of this song on Shindig. Actually, it's on my page from a couple of weeks ago, but it's an incredible performance. Number 4 is "Mr. Tambourine Man" by the Byrds, the record that in effect gave birth to folk rock. 3 is "I'm Henry VIII I Am" by Herman's Hermits, which is actually an old British music hall song that Joe Brown used to perform. And at that point, Herman's Hermits were extremely popular. They had a big boom that spring, as did Freddie and the Dreamers, as part of the British invasion. Number 2 is in the opinion of a lot of people, the record of the summer of '65. "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," the record that really launched the Rolling Stones to the runner-up position among really the world's rock groups. And number 1 is a certified Motown classic, written and produced by Holland Dozier and Holland. "I Can't Help Myself" by the Four Tops. So that's the top 10 from 50 years ago this week, as from WABC in New York on their All-American Survey, and that's courtesy of Alan Sniffin's New York Radio Message Board.
I have if anybody's interested, I have the top 10 Billboard, which is a slightly different,
right?
Not entirely. It's got several of the songs, including Satisfaction, and I Can't Help Myself. I'll run it down really quickly. 10 is Jackie DeShannon, What the World Needs Now Is Love. 9 is Yes, I'm Ready, Barbara Mason. 8 is Crying in the Chapel by Elvis. 7 is Seventh Son by Johnny Rivers. 6 is For Your Love. 5 is Wonderful World. 4 is Wooly Bully. 3 is Mr. Tambourine Man. 2 is Satisfaction, and 1 is Can't Help Myself. So it's slightly different. But one thing that when you mentioned Cara Mia, Al, do you remember hearing? I remember hearing Dan Ingram play Cara Mia on WABC, and stretching out Jay Black's.
Oh, that last note. Yeah. Yes,
Yep.
indeed.
That was just hilarious. I mean, he stretched it. Must have stretched it out for a minute. It was great.
Yeah.
It was funny. Anyway, sorry to, but I mean, it's so cool to go back and I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I've said this before that the music of today just does not compare to the music of back then. Whether you want to talk about 64, 65, 66, there's just no comparison as far as.
Well, remember that it's a completely different atmosphere now. It's a completely different music business. Also, the music isn't being directed at dinosaurs like us. It's being, as it's always been, it's being marketed toward teenagers, 20-somethings, the quote-unquote desired democratic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no way that we can really, get much of a feeling for what's out there now. Just as our parents couldn't understand what this, I can't get no satisfaction. What are all those dirty lyrics about trying to make some girl tell me, whatever, and it's always been pretty much like that.
I was wondering if one difference from today was, I wonder if it was, did you guys experience this at the time? In retrospect, it seemed like there were so many social changes, the civil rights, the war, anti-war movement, the pill, psychedelics, all kind of converging, even if they weren't explicitly in the lyrics or anything. It seemed like that there was a spirit that the music was sort of channeling, which I don't think today. Maybe gay rights, maybe civil rights a little bit, but doesn't seem like there's any kind of equivalent social transformation that's taken music to a higher level in a sense these days. So it seems a little bit more boring in a sense these days.
A record like Eve of Destruction never would have gotten played in today's atmosphere, because it would have been felt, oh no, you can't, this is too controversial. And so it never would have even made, I shouldn't say made air, because now there's all these other alternatives.
Yeah. I just want to say a few things about radio in general.
Please.
I mean, it's very easy to look back and say those were the golden days. And believe me, I feel the same way as you guys. I think the 60s was such a golden era. And for me, I love the 70s too. That's really more my decade, even more so than the 60s. But believe me, I treasure the 60s and appreciate the 60s more now than I ever have. But radio is such a different animal now, because everything is so specialized. And there is music, I think, that can appeal to people that grew up in the 60s and 70s that's being played now. It's just not, for my taste, what's being played on the CHR contemporary hit radio of today. I think that to me is garbage, and that's just my own personal opinion. I don't expect everyone else to agree, but it's just, that's what we grew up with. It was a time of incredible transformation, and the music really was powerful. It was at a time, I think, when Top 40 was really blossoming as a format, and music was so eclectic, and it reflected that in the Top 40 of the time. And that affected my musical taste more than anything else. The fact that you could hear a pop record, a rock record, a novelty record, a country record, an R&B record, all that on the same station. You could hear the Beatles and then Lorne Greene doing Ringo, and then Dean Martin with Everybody Loves Somebody, and then Motown, a Motown song, and then Roger Miller with Dang Me. It's all on the same station. And that's something that's missing, because you don't have that eclecticism on one format of radio unless it's a non-commercial station. So
Right.
that affects the way that people are being brought up in our culture today. You have to listen to a specialized format to find the music that really appeals to you, and that's if you want to go through all the trouble of hunting it down yourself. Young people, a lot of people today don't necessarily listen to a radio station. They try to find the music that they like just by going on the internet or hearing what their friends are saying or file sharing and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So radio, I don't think, is the presence that it used to be. And I think it's a really sad thing. I'm sorry I'm babbling on here. That we don't have we don't have the unified culture that we once did when we had fewer radio stations with bigger audiences all hearing the same thing. So it's easier to relate to that time when so many people all loved the same music, or we all shared similar tastes, more similar tastes probably then more than now. So that's a huge difference. That radio plays such a big difference between the way it was then and the way it is now.
Mm-hmm.
Our culture is very different. It's a completely different landscape. And I want to be fair to today's music because there is a lot of good stuff that's coming out these days, but less people are hearing it because it's reaching smaller audiences because the formats are more specialized.
Is that
But,
for the advertisers? Did they figure they could make more money, like narrow casting, and they could charge advertisers more? Is that why it changed the radio?
Mhm. Yep.
Well, yeah. The advertisers want to know their demographic audience, and the music that they program is supposed to reflect what they think is their demographic audience. So as long as they're appealing to that audience, then they'll get advertising.
So advertising diminished music for everyone in a way, it's a strange way.
Well, there always was advertising to begin with. Listen to Top 40 Radio back then. My God,
my
you know how many
goodness.
commercials were on in 1 hour?
There were commercials after every song.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
just meant that. I guess for them chasing the advertising dollar, that's what broke us into smaller niche audiences and doesn't get the eclectic, big stations like you were talking about before. You know, but
It's true.
But anyway, I can pick probably any week from 1964 through 69, if we're talking the 60s. Any week, look at the top 10 and go, oh my God,
Yeah.
look at all those
exactly.
songs, and think that just about every single one of them is great. So, getting back to what I was saying before, I want to just compare 64 to 65 as years because I know, Steve, you said there's nothing that can compare to 1964 for you, certainly as a Beatle fan. But other than the lyric changes and everything else that you mentioned, why wouldn't you think 1964 was just as revolutionary? Because the biggest change in 64 was the Beatles and the British invasion,
Really?
by far. That really affected so much. Why wouldn't you put that in the same category as 65?
Well, I didn't. Now you're.
I'm saying this to all of you. I'm saying this to all of you,
okay.
not just you, Steve.
I did say a few weeks ago that I thought if I had to pin down a year, 64 was the year because basically of the Beatles. But there were so many great things happening, year by year by year. I mean, it was just one thing after another, one surprise after another. You had all the great stuff happening this year. You had the Who coming in. I mean, you had all the Beatle things that happened in 65. But I mean, there were just things from year to year going on, and it was, we never knew what was going to come down, and everything that was coming down was exploding against the establishment because the establishment didn't know what the hell was going on with the kids. Today's a little different because the establishment and the youth culture have intertwined so much more than they did back then. Things were separated back then very much, and adults really looked down on what kids were doing. So, I think that things are a lot different today than they were back then. But there were just so many great things happening from week to week, and you had the great radio stations. The radio culture had a lot to do with it because radio culture, as you said, is a lot different now than it is then. I think there's actually more influence in radio back then. Ken, you probably might. I don't know if you're going to agree with that or not, but I mean, I think the historically, if you look back at history, I think when you had some of the great DJs that we had, you know,
Oh yeah.
they nailed it as far as, you know, leading the pack as far as what was going on, you know. So you don't see DJs doing that. I mean, you have DJs like on Sirius and stuff doing, playing music, but there certainly isn't the power and the influence that we had back in the '60s at all.
Oh, I totally agree with you there.
Hmm.
If you like the top 40 format, that period of the 60s and 70s, and I can't really relate to the 50s there. I love the 50s music. I don't really know radio from the 50s that well. But yeah, the DJs mattered. People went to concerts in part to see their DJ introducing
Sure.
some of the acts that were on stage. And that, as far as DJs that actually played music, you don't really have that now. On most radio stations, you have a morning team that's like a
Right.
comedy team, and that's about it
Hmm.
for personality. Most
Yeah.
personality is on talk radio. It's on talk radio now.
Right.
So I'm not saying there aren't some select examples in the country, but that was at a time when personality mattered and the way you delivered and talked up a song. And, certain jocks had their own style that made them their own. Whereas gradually radio became less personality driven for music stations and they cared more about playing music and have less talk.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that, Steve. The DJs certainly, I can only talk about New York because that's what I listen to, but the DJs that I grew up with on WABC in the 60s and 70s were the greatest to me. They're my heroes.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I totally agree.
But the music, getting back to the music of '65, I mean, we had such an upswelling of incredible things going on. The number one song on the first day of January was "I Feel Fine," believe it or not, and the number one song the last week of December was "Over and Over" by the Dave Clark Five, which actually "Over and Over" is probably a bad example of influential songs. But I
Yeah.
mean, but there are so many. I mean,
The ones on either side, I think we can work it out. And Sound of Silence were on either side of Over and Over. I think
Yes.
those are going towards probably what it sounded like you were heading towards. With the
Yeah.
contrasting the beginning and the end of the year.
well, that's it.
Hmm.
That same week at the end of December, you also had in the top 10 "Let's Hang On" by the Four Seasons, England Swings, which you'd have to talking about eclecticism. I Can Never Go Home Anymore by the Shangri-Las, which I absolutely adore. I mean and yeah, We Can Work It Out was number 11 that week. So you had all sorts of things going on. I mean, you had just talk about the Shangri-Las. I mean, they were, they had a hell of an influence on not only on guys but on pop culture. I mean, I remember adoring them back in the '60s. I won't. Let's not even go there. I mean, they were fantastic. They really were. That music is just something else. And there were so many good things happening in music that year. I mean, it was great stuff. It's hard to nail down one thing, you know.
You can almost show the Beatles their number one singles shows like a really interesting arc because it goes
Yes.
I Feel Fine 8 days a
Yeah.
week, then suddenly Ticket to Ride, Help gets darker, than Yesterday pretty heavy, and then We Can Work It Out. It kind of they kind of definitely had a arc going that year, a growth progression. That's
Right.
pretty.
Hmm.
They were getting a lot more serious in '65. They weren't they were still the Fab Four. I mean, that wouldn't leave until start fading out until next year, until '66. But they were getting a lot more serious. It wasn't "I Want to Hold Your Hand" anymore. So
And there was even as big as Herman's Hermits were in that spring and summer, as big as Freddie and the Dreamers were for a short time in that spring, as big as Satisfaction and The Last Time and Get Off of My Cloud were for the Rolling Stones. There was never a doubt at any point in that year who the biggest group in the pop world was.
hmm
I mean, the Shea Stadium, the first concert at Shea Stadium sold out via word of mouth. You know, those posters that you've seen that are out there with Sid Bernstein Presents, those are fakes. There were actually, in fact, Dave Schwensen, who we're hoping to get on the show very soon, has pointed that out, that those posters didn't exist until afterward. That because Brian Epstein had pretty much stipulated that there be no overt promotion for that concert at Shea Stadium. So it basically sold out through word of mouth and Top 40 radio. And
well, Top 40 radio was so huge. I mean, just a mention of that on a station like WABC, and you know it's going to sell out quickly.
Right. Absolutely. But if it had been any other group, there were no guarantees that a show like that would have sold out, especially without any overt, any overt promotion. But that's how huge the Beatles were. And
then the next year they didn't sell out, right? They didn't sell out. Their pinnacle. Yeah, maybe the
66.
66.
Right, that and also, a lot of the original girl fans were by that time 3 years older, and were, had kind of moved on from wanting to go to shows and scream and leave wet seats and all that sort of stuff. But it was, but there was, they, in fact, 1965, in 1965, the Beatles were never again as universally popular as they were in 1965. And there was never a moment's doubt that they were the biggest pop act in the world. The following year, all the controversies began, and then the drug revelations and things like that. And even some fan resistance to Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. Some of the younger fans, as Candy Leonard has gone into in her book, Beatleness. But in '65, they were still absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the biggest pop act in the world.
See, that's one thing I would question you on, Al, because, I know they sold out Shea, they sold out everywhere in 65. 66 was a different story, which is hard for me to admit, considering these are the Beatles we're talking about, but also the Beatles being bigger than Jesus, quote, had a lot to do with loss of sales, concert ticket sales. But still, if you look at the charts from year to year, every Beatles album just about went to number one.
Right.
They still had number one singles, so it's not like I would say that they really took a dive in any way after 65.
Well, only when I'm talking about universal popularity, because in '66, you had all, especially that, what I call the summer in hell, from the Butcher cover to the Jesus controversy to Manila, and all
Japan.
the rest of us.
Right.
What? I'm sorry.
Oh, they had death threats in Japan too for playing.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, and also there was some resistance by some of the younger fans who were not really that musically sophisticated to the advances in Rubber Soul and especially Revolver and then Sgt. Pepper. So, right. So they never were again as universally popular as they were in 1965.
The Monkees came in, right? The Monkees came in
60,
and took the
in
Beatles
66. Yeah, and
with
a lot of those younger girl fans, particularly, kind of took the Monkees to their hearts, because they were, their music was more accessible to them than Tomorrow Never Knows.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that just reminded me of another, when you were mentioning how is 65, how good 64 was, just as, revolutionary, which on some level I obviously totally agree with. I would say one other difference might be 65 was when the British art school rockers like the Kinks and I don't know if the Yardbirds per se were an art school, but they started trying to imitate a sitar with, the fuzz pedal, the beginnings of psychedelia, where they had mastered the blues and the rock forms in '64, and now they were kind of using their artsy minds to start getting psychedelic, the glimmers of it.
Right. Oh, there's
Exactly.
no doubt in my mind that there were so many changes being made in the music in terms of lyrics, in terms of the production, the instrumentation. 65 was an enormous year of advancement there. The only thing I come back to as a question is, does that make it the best year? It might be the most interesting year.
I mean, I just have a personal preference for 1965. I think there were, just for me, there were more great records that I particularly liked. But I'm not saying that it's a be all and end all, but that 1965 is the greatest year. But I would put it up against any other year in the 60s, kind of record for record, because, as I said, you could go to, I read off that top 10 from this week. You could go to the top 10 or top 20 on almost any top 40 radio station or the national charts for virtually any week that year, and you'll see just the number of what we would now consider classic records is mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. But the difference between you've brought up a couple of times the difference between 64 and 65, just that 64 was a transitional year, but 65 is really where, as I mentioned before, those bands that kind of began to formulate in the wake of the Beatles' first impact in America really kind of came to the fore in 65. And that includes the Byrds, as a matter of fact. And then you bring Dylan's entrance into the rock arena in there as well, along with there obviously Motown's kind of golden era. You could say began either in 63 or 64, but it was in 65 that it really went into hyperdrive. So
right.
and the first major hits out of Stax from Otis Redding, from Wilson Pickett, even though he was technically not on Stax, but recorded there, and so much more that went into what I call the musical stew that was 1965.
Right.
A lot of great albums too. In a way, it was the beginning of the album era with Dylan's two albums that year, and Rubber Soul, and the Who's album, the Byrds album. Really, the album form really kicked in.
And as a matter of fact, we're recording this the day after the Grateful Dead played what they say is their final concert at Soldier Field in Chicago. And as Andrew points out in his book, it was 50 years ago that the Grateful Dead formed in San Francisco.
Actually, Palo Alto, to get technical. Okay.
and some of the other personalities who would emerge from the San Francisco scene also were beginning to get involved. Grace Slick was the lead singer with a group called the Great Society that was playing the ballrooms and such in San Francisco at that point. So yeah, as Andrew said, kind of the album rock era was both on the surface and below was really beginning in 1965. So whereas 64 was this great transitional year, 65 is where so much of the music began to really emerge.
Right.
Okay. How would you compare this to, say, I don't want to exclude 1966, but 1967 is looked upon, certainly in radio, as the important year when rock music was really changing and albums became the art form, and you had, the classic albums like Sgt. Pepper and Surrealistic Pillow and Jimi Hendrix's first album and The Doors. For classic rock radio, they rarely ever play anything pre-1967 unless there's a specific reason behind it. But as far as music that relates to what's going on today in classic rock radio, it seems to start in 1967.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually that was the thing that I love about 65 is because in a way it has its feet in both camps, because a lot of the music sounds like what you call oldies music today, but then you have like with the Yardbirds and all that the beginning of that classic rock sound. So that's what always fascinated me with the year, was that it was sort of the year that the classic 67 sound started kind of emerging from the era of, like you were mentioning, Jay and the Americans and the Vogues, and the Four Seasons and everything. It's like an overlap of those two things, which I really enjoy.
I think there were groups though from pre-67 that got a lot of attention. That Simon, the Beatles, of course, Simon and Garfunkel, the Byrds, obviously. So I think there were a number of pre-67 groups. Paul Revere and the Raiders are another one. So I mean, there's and Good Vibrations came out in '66. So there was a lot of good music in '66. The thing about '66 though is that it took what had been had already happened in '64 and '65, and just really built on what had already come. And I think if you're going to characterize '66, it's really the progression year. I mean, incredible progression. I mean, everybody evolved like crazy in '66. They didn't really. I think that's what the problem. If there's if you want to say something about '65, things were still just getting started in '65, where in '66 everything just took off.
Right.
There were
in '66 you've got you've got the Mamas and Papas, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears. You've got Dylan's Blonde on Blonde. You've got the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. You've got the first Rascals album. You've got Revolver. Just those five
Aftermath.
alone.
Right.
Yes, thank you. Aftermath. Right.
Blonde on Blonde.
So, yeah, right. Exactly. And so when you have just a few classic albums of that ilk, along with many others, it was a monumental year. Absolutely. That's like I said. I mean, you could put a postage stamp over 65 and 66 in terms of the quality of the music. That's how close it is. As I said, I just happen to have a personal preference for 65.
I'm just running down a list here of some of the records of 65, and I mean there are so many deep cuts that were so much fun to listen to. The Jolly Green Giant is one.
Right. The Kingsmen,
yeah, that's another one. I'm just running down a list here. Let's Lock the Door. That's another great Jay and the American song. Have you seen Jay perform lately, Al?
I haven't myself, because he's kind of semi-retired now, and he mainly performs either out on Long Island in Ken's old stomping grounds, or in Florida, for the retirees. But he's, from all reports, he still has that near operatic voice.
Amazing.
Yeah, I've seen him a number of times, actually. He still sounds great. He really does. Yeah. I don't think he holds on to that long note in Caramia like he used to, but no, he could still sing great for a full hour, and no, his voice is still in great shape.
Yeah. Somebody else to mention is Chad and Jeremy, who do still sound absolutely freaking fantastic. I mean, that is. I admit I have not seen them. Have not seen them recently. I did see them a while back, and they just blew me over how good they sounded. It's amazing, and I was very lucky to talk to Chad Stewart about a year ago, and it was fantastic talking to them. One of my favorite moments is that Dick Van Dyke show. I love that Dick Van Dyke show.
Sure.
That is a show I could watch over and over and over again. And of course, it's all parallel. It's all Beatles parallel in there. So
sure, of course.
But I mean, there's just so many. Oh God, those when you talk about Unit 4+2, Concrete and Clay, even Freddie and the Dreamers. I thought I've seen going through Billboard archives, Billboard ads from '65, and I'd forgotten that Freddie and the Dreamers actually got launched in '65, not in '64.
Well, here they had their boom is in '65, but for instance, I'm telling you now, which was their number one record in the U.S. in the spring of '65, actually had been a number 2 single in England in the fall of '63, and a record called "She Loves You" kept them out of the number 1 spot on the English charts. So and "You Were Made for Me," the follow-up, was also from that same time.
Do you know they did an album of Disney covers, Freddie and the Dreamers?
Yeah.
That's amazing. I believe the album is on CD for anybody interested. But yeah, they did an album of Disney covers. It's unbelievable.
Is that after the Beatles turned down Jungle Book? Didn't they base those vultures on the Beatles and the Jungle Book? But John Lennon.
Yeah, I would assume so. Yeah. And that is indeed a true story. That for anybody that hasn't heard that is true. That the vultures were based on the Beatles. I couldn't believe that when I first heard it, and it was like, really? And but actually, was it a few? I'm trying to remember. Several years ago, they had Disneyland had a thing called America Sings. This is way back. It's gone. It's long gone now. But they had the vultures in America Sings, and so anyway. But
I just want to say I've seen Chad and Jeremy many times, and several years ago they reunited for the first time in a long time, and they sound exactly the same as they did in the '60s. I mean, it's time has stood still with Chad and Jeremy. So if you ever get a chance, they only do a few dates here and there, but whenever they do perform, go see them. And there's one other band that we haven't mentioned. I'm sure there are others, but the Zombies are a band that, they were ahead of their time, really, because they mixed rock with jazz elements.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
They are still going strong. They're still making new music. They're still touring, and they're phenomenal. They really are. Anyone who gets a chance should see the Zombies. Colin Blunstone, the lead singer, sounds phenomenal. He's 70 years old now, and he's got a voice of an angel. Rod Argent is still a tear right there on the keyboards. So, yeah.
Bobby Fuller 4, I Fought the Law.
Well, that was actually '66. Go ahead.
It
go
was
ahead.
funny when I was writing the book. There are so many things that are like December '65. They say that some people say they were released, some people say not. So, who knows? I guess
they may have been released in December, but they really didn't become hits until maybe the late winter or early spring of '66.
There's a great clip of Bobby Fuller on Hullabaloo that I know is on YouTube. That is well worth catching. That is absolutely amazing. And since we're talking about '66 music, another clip to dig out on YouTube is the original music video for "These Boots Are Made for Walking," which is absolutely a scream. But anyway.
Well, we've run out of time here, actually, because I can't believe this hour has just flown by.
It has. But
Andrew, we want to thank you for being a great guest with us on the show. Once again, the name of your book is called 1965, The Most Revolutionary Year in Music. You also wrote a book on the solo Beatles, which we didn't mention before, which is called Still the Greatest, The Essential Songs of the Beatles' Solo Careers. Maybe we'll have you on to talk about that.
Oh, I'd love to anytime. And there's websites for both books, 1965book.com and solobeatles.com.
You also did a Where's Waldo Beatle book, didn't you?
Yeah, it's where that one. The other books are all text, but there's a book called Where's Ringo that's got 20 illustrations where you have to find Ringo and all these other Beatles-related pop culture things. And
there we go.
I wrote the accompanying text, and some great artists did all the pictures.
Yes, I've seen that book. That's a wonderful book. It's a great book for a gift. So
So, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. I just want to mention, if you can, please check out my own website, which is kenmichaelsradio.com. There's a couple of new interviews that are on there. One is with Adam Ippolito, the keyboardist from Elephant's Memory. And we were mentioning Dave Schwensen before, who we're hoping to have on the show. He's got a new book out, The Beatles at Shea Stadium. So new interviews there on my website, kenmichaelsradio.com.
I probably should put in a plug, since we've been discussing 1965, that what I do is each day I put in one of the 365 reasons why 1965 is the greatest year in the history of rock and roll on my Facebook page, which is under Al Sussman, or you can access it on Twitter at asus49.
You actually put one song in there, Al, that I was very pleased that you posted.
Which
that
one?
being, of course, the clapping song from Shirley Ellis. Hey, 369, the goose drank wine. Where do you find songs like that? Come on. The monkey chewed tobacco.
Well, they're trying to cover the whole spectrum.
That's right. Hey, I said novelty records too. They were a big part of the 60s.
Yeah. Soupy.
And that's right, the mouse.
Right.
That was 65, right?
April.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Hey, he was on with the Beatles. That's Sullivan.
That's true.
Yeah. And if people want to get in touch with you, Steve, they could do so how?
BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. And I'm also, I have my own personal Facebook page, and I also hang around the Beatles News and Commentary group page, and I hang around a lot of places, but those are the best places to find me. You can always message me either by email or on PM on Facebook, and I'll be glad to reply.
Okay, and if you want to get in touch with all of us at the show, our email address is thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. All right, on behalf of Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, in absentia, Alan Kozin, and Andrew Grant Jackson, this is Ken Michaels saying thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.